Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about crop rotation. This is a satellite view of the Southeast Farm. It's a farmer-owned research experiment farm, and it's staffed by SDSU, and it's owned by a nonprofit farmer association. Farm started in the 1950s, and this farm was established by that association in early 60s. And you can see with these plots here, we've got a lot of different crops going in rotation. We're mostly at corn, soybean, small grain rotation. And we're really looking for several things for our rotation to do for us. We're expecting it to keep the soil covered. We're trying to maintain our beneficial microbes in the soil. We're trying to break pathogen cycles and pest cycles with our rotation. And we're trying to balance nutrient and water use. And I suppose that most of the folks here are more interested in horticultural crops. So I'm going to kind of just talk about crop rotation in general on a conceptual level. Joslyn's going to address some of the horticultural research we're doing at the farm. And Brad's going to tell us about livestock research we're doing that fits in the rotation too. So just kind of looking at it at a conceptual level as an ecosystem, there's kind of 4 dimensions or ways we can look at a system just to kind of define where it's going. This is from Alan Savory's work. And first question is, where's the energy going? What's the energy flow? Second thing is, what's the nutrient cycle? Where are the nutrients coming and going in that system? How's it using water versus when the water comes with the precipitation? And then community dynamics, this is the biological element to think about. What's happening to the beneficial organisms that I want to be there, and then what's my rotation doing relative to pathogens and pests that I don't want to be there. So that's your biological community. How is it affecting that? And we can kind of think of this energy and nutrient flow. In a pasture, it's kind of easier to reflect on it. The energy is coming in from the sun to the plants. The plants are photosynthesizing. Cows are eating the grass, they're making milk, and now the energy is going to the calf. And eventually they're going to defecate and it will go in the soil, and the leftover plant material will go in the soil. So that's kind of your energy cycle. Starts from the sun to the plants and goes to the animals. And a similar level it's going on underground with your soil microorganisms. The plants are capturing solar energy. They're releasing that from root exudates, and also when the plant dies, the residue at the surface decomposing, that feeds the microbes in the soil. And if we think about this with cover cropping, here we've got some plots where we split and we have a rye cover crop as part of the rotation versus not. And what this is doing for us here, we have green leaf material. It's absorbing energy from the sun. That energy that it captures is going to go back into the soil, into the system when we spray that rye out and plant the next crop. So we're feeding the soil here. On this side of it, the energy is coming down. It's just hitting the dead corn stalks, bare soil. It's going to be radiated back as heat. So we're not capturing energy on this side, but on this side we are. Also, this cover crop is pulling nutrients out of the soil, bringing them up to the surface. So that helps us too as far as making more available for the next crop. However, it does use water, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. So you got to think about what's this doing to your water balance. And also you have to think about what's that going to do. As it decomposes, it'll tie up some nitrogen initially. And depending on what you're raising next, that might be a plus or a minus. If your next crop is soybeans, soybeans can fix their own nitrogen. Have rye tie up nitrogen is a plus because it's keeping it away from the weeds. If your next crop is corn, then corn needs a lot of nitrogen, and that tying up nitrogen is a detriment. So that's another rotational thing to think about. What's this doing to my nutrient balance? What's it doing to my water balance for the next crop? And we'll keep this microphone thing together. This is kind of just a conceptual schematic looking at ecosystem energy flow coming from the sun to the primary producers are plants. And as this goes down, you get less and less at each trophic level because you're losing more to heat and respiration at every step. good part of it goes to decomposition. Then you have the herbivores, which are like the cows that eat the plants, the carnivores that eat the herbivores, and your top carnivores. And we can see the same thing happening on a microscopic level inside the soil. You have your plants that capture the energy from the sun, they send it to their roots, and you have things that feed on the roots, and you also have fungi and bacteria that, when the plant dies, that break down the crop residues. And then you have other organisms like amoebas and things that eat the bacteria that are breaking down the residues. And as that's going on, they're releasing nutrients. So as this goes through this cycle, you're burning off energy, and then the nutrients that were held here initially are being released back to the soil. As we think about the rotation, then one of the things we're kind of interested in are these beneficial microbes, and a good example of that is mycorrhizae, mycorrhizal fungi. And this is a picture of a ginkgo tree root. And this is a root cell here. This is a mycorrhizal fungi, arbuscle, that's colonized inside the root cell. It has hyphae that will go out into the soil. So it will bring in nutrients right to the root. And it's structured, it's got this symbiotic relationship with the plants, and will release nutrients to the plant, and the plant in turn gives it energy, because the plant's got the leaves up in the sun to collect energy, which the fungi can't get. So they're helping each other out. And this has a big factor with phosphorus availability. It's also a big factor with your micronutrients, zinc. And it's another rotational element to consider. Some of your species that are in the Brassica group don't form associations with mycorrhizal fungi. So if you have a rotation where you have brassicas, your mycorrhizal fungi population will be a little less for the following crop. Especially if you have a fallow period in your rotation. That creates what's called a fallow syndrome, and they first recognized it because following a fallow, plants needed more phosphorus. And what it was a function of was these mycorrhizae don't have any plants to partner with when you have a fallow, so they die out. Then the next crop that you plant after the fallow period doesn't have the benefit of mycorrhizal fungi, and it needs more phosphorus to meet needs more phosphorus in the soil to meet its needs. So that's another element to consider in your rotation. Does your crop need mycorrhizal fungi? And if so, you want it to follow something that's a good host for it, because you're trying to promote these. Also, there's bacteria. This is a picture of Azospirillum on sorghum root that are beneficial in the soil and can form positive relationships. So the plants are feeding those microbes, and then they're helping out the plants with increasing nutrient availability. And those little microbes and having good soil health also helps with your physical structure. So just by way of example, this is from our rotation study. This is a no-till field. We've kept residue on the surface, and it's been no-till about 30 years. This was in 2019 when we had a really wet spring. And you can see this plot doesn't have any standing water. And also, you can kind of see the tractor, where the tractor went, but it's holding up physically. It's got better structure. This one is right next to it. So this plot here is right there in this picture. And this plot right here is this one here. So these are side by side. And you can see in this tilled system, the tillage destroys the mycorrhizal network. You don't have as good a structure because you don't have the residue on the surface that benefits the microorganisms and protects the soil. And you can see physically the structure is weaker, doesn't hold up traffic. I think Brad went through there with the fertilizer spreader and just about got stuck. So a big difference, just 60 feet apart. And it's a function of keeping the soil covered and protecting the soil and feeding those microbes versus not. So you have big benefits there. In terms of your water economy, you're getting infiltration rather than runoff. And in terms of your physical trafficability of the soil. And those microbes help you out with your nutrient availability. Yeah.
Plus, I'm guessing the earthworms are doing the tillage for you over here to get rid of the excess water through the tunneling.
Right, right. You've got more macropores over here because you're not breaking them up with tillage. Yeah. Okay. So we have good and poor nutrients, mineral cycles. This is from Alan Savory. I just took this picture out of his book, and he's got this as his example of a good one, and a poor one. It's just conceptual, but in a system where you have lots of living roots, they capture nutrients from the soil, they bring them up to the surface, they concentrate them near the surface where your crops can get to them, and you don't have runoff. In a system where you don't have much living there, the soil is susceptible to runoff. That's what these lateral arrows are supposed to mean. So you have rain come down and you have runoff instead of going in the soil, so you're not making good use of your water. And also you're not capturing nutrients out of the soil as much, so you have more leaching. So we kind of want to keep the soil covered, and we want to have living roots if we can, to hold on to the nutrients and feed the microbes. Livestock are another component here that can help out with nutrient cycling. Generally where we have cattle, that accelerates the turnover and release of nutrients from the residues because they digest it, and most of it goes out the back end and is available. And the other thing that cattle do in a rotation is they allow you to introduce forage crops, and there's a whole slew of different forage crops you could potentially use to fit your whatever's going to follow next. So you could be using oats and barley and peas. You could be going with forage sorghums. You could have cowpeas and millets. You could have brassicas. So having cattle in the situation allows you to accelerate residue breakdown if you're trying to move the residue to cycle faster. And also it gives you a lot of options for different forages that you can use to break pest cycles. And this is just some table with some data on pasture plants yet to be grazed. It's from a physiology textbook. That carbon and nitrogen and the carbon and nitrogen ratio. And the cattle, if you start out with 100 units of carbon and 10 of nitrogen, so this is kind of hypothetical. The cattle take in 5, but the retained in the animal is only 0.05. So it's less than 10% stays in the animal. Most of what they eat goes through them. So you don't really lose the nutrients out of your system except for phosphorus. If you've got a growing animal and it's skeletal growth, it's adding size, it'll tie up about half the phosphorus that it eats. But if you've got a full-grown cow out there or an animal that's already framed up, most of it's going to pass through. Okay, so thinking about nutrients, kind of shifting to water a little bit. And where are we at for time?
We still have about 45 minutes.
45 minutes, okay, all right. Okay, so this, just to explain this graph a little bit, this is based on estimated crop water use. I did this some time ago for Huron. It was based on, I think, 20-year average, weather averages. And so we've got daily water use, inches per day, tops out around 1/4 of an inch a day. And then I've got week of the year here. So we got April, May, June, July, August, September. And this is crop water use. So average crop water use for wheat, spring wheat. This blue line would be for corn, and the red triangles would be for soybean. So there's a couple points to consider here in terms of your water balance. One thing is, if you've got a small grain here, it's gonna increased water use as the plant grows, and then also warmer temperatures in June, July, August are going to push water use. So you got those two factors, the size of your crop, its stage of its growth, and then the temperature. So as the plants get bigger, it gets warmer, they use more water. Then for your small grain, it matures and it's done using water sometime in July. So that means this moisture out here can be carried over to the next year. So in terms of your water balance situation, if you're trying to conserve moisture for the next year, having this small grain ahead of your crop that needs extra water is a good choice because it's going to leave some moisture afterwards, more likely. Second thing that you can see from this graph is now, if I'm using this as a cover crop, right? So this would be like wheat, oats, rye. My water use goes way up. At the end of April, I'm not even using 5/100ths of an inch a day. By the time I get to the end of May, I'm using about 2/10ths of an inch per day. So I'm really cranking up water use as this develops during May. So now if I'm using this as a cover crop and I'm in a dry situation, it's going to burn up a lot of water by the time I get to the end of May. So maybe if I'm in a dry situation, I want to save that water, I want to kill the cover crop early. So if you think about both sides of that in terms of your rotation, what's it doing as a cover crop? Am I using moisture that I need for the next crop? Maybe in a wet spring, I want to get rid of that moisture. You know, it's going to vary from place to place and year to year, but it's something to think about. Second thing is, how's my cropping pattern? How's it going to set me up for the next crop? So if the small grains end their life cycle early, that's conservative for saving soil moisture for the next year. Okay, so I kind of want to talk about community dynamics a little bit. I'm kind of ambivalent to cats, but my wife likes them, so we have cats. And but one thing we have with having cats, we don't have mice. So that's an example of community dynamics. If I can keep a beneficial organism in the zone I'm trying to control, it'll keep the pests out for me. So I want, in my rotation and in my system, I want to think about what am I doing to the beneficial, particularly predators that are on my side in that system. If I can keep them active, keep them part of the system, then I'm going to have to expend less energy. I'm going to save inputs trying to control pests. So we think about community dynamics. Or is my system harboring pests? Then that's going to create trouble for me in the future. So as we consider that, we think about the life history strategies of different organisms, and each species has a particular strategy that it uses to persist and carry over from generation to generation. And in the ecological world, they call this a R versus K selection. And I don't know where that comes from. I'm going to guess it's some German guys that started this, and it makes sense in Germany or the Netherlands or somewhere. But it's R versus K if you look at the agroecology texts. So our species have high fecundity. They have a lot of offspring, short generation time. They're not competitive, and they're high dispersal, and they tend to be pioneer species. So these are things that have lots of offspring in a hurry. That's their strategy. That's how they're going to persist. And they take off quickly, and this tends to be your pest species. They tend to come into an area, reproduce really quickly, and take off fast. Then your K selection species tend to have fewer offspring. They live longer, and they tend to be highly competitive, and they tend to not regenerate as quickly. So these are more what your predator organisms are going to tend to fall into this K species. And so that takes them more time for them to regenerate. So Your R species tend to have short life, rapid growth, early maturity, many small offspring, and little parental care or protection, and they're adapted to unstable environments, and they tend to be pioneers, colonizers. Your K's approach, a longer life, slower growth, later maturity, higher parental care, higher investment, and they tend to be adapted to stable environments. And they tend to be more the predators, and these tend to be more the prey. So a rabbit is an example of an R strategist, and these bears are an example of a K strategist. So in your system, if you're using control measures that take out your K strategists, let's say I go in the field and I am applying a broad spectrum insecticide to control aphids. Well, I might control the aphids, but if I kill all the things that eat the aphids will come back faster than the predators. And I might have a worse problem 2 or 3 weeks down the road. And when I worked used to work in northern Maine, and the plant pathologists wanted aphids there because they were studying viral movement in potato plants. Remember, our previous speaker talked about the insects that carry viruses. So if there were no insects for the virologist guys, that's a problem. They want the insects to spread the virus so they can see what happens. So what do they do if their potato field doesn't have any aphids? They spray a broad spectrum insecticide. They spray a broad spectrum insecticide. If they want aphids, that's what you do. You spray it, about 3 weeks later, they'll have a spike in the aphid population. So you don't want to pull the trigger too quickly on these insecticides and control measures, and you want to think about your system, your rotation, what are you doing to these beneficial organisms that are on your side. The same thing can kind of be said with tillage and the mycorrhizae. Back here, these guys, these networks take time to develop in the soil, right? You get a mycorrhizal network. So if you have a no-till system, they have more opportunity to develop and move through the system. And if you've got a lot of tillage, it breaks them up and they don't recover as fast. So try and keep going here. So you just want to think about what your rotation's doing there. So disturbance and succession is once you disturb a system, it takes time for it changes. You have your pioneer species come in, and then following that you have longer lived species, and that changes the habitat over time. And so we can kind of think of this in an obvious sense with forest systems. If you clear a forest, you don't get trees back in 1 year. You start with some annuals that cover the soil and protect it, and you get some shrubs, you get some softwoods if you're in the east, and you end up with hardwoods. And as this system grows, as you go further along in the stages, you get to have more stability, more diversity, and better, higher productivity. So we kind of want to mimic that with our rotation. We want to get to this point where we have more diversity, and we get it by switching between crops from year to year. But we want to think about how this succession is going to work and benefit the next crop. And this is just an example with corn yields, a tilled and no-till system. This is a 2-year rotation, corn, soybean. This is a 3-year rotation, corn, soybean, small grain. This is a 4-year rotation, so it's 1 year out of 4 that we're raising corn, soybean, oats, winter rye. And we can see that the no-till responded very strongly to the longer delay in rotation. So we picked up about 16, 17 bushel an acre in the no-till system with a 4-year rotation. And in the tilled system, we picked up about 6 or 7 bushel per acre. And actually in a 2-year system, the tillage did better than the no-till. In a 4-year system, the no-till did better than the tilled. So what's happening here is in this 2-year system, we're not getting enough time for the corn stover to break down, and the residue is carrying over diseases. And the tillage buries the residue, breaks it down faster, and so we see a response to tillage in that situation. We lengthen the rotation out. 3 years, they're equal. 4 years, the no-till is better. Now we're allowing Mother Nature to break down the residue for us, and we're getting those beneficial organisms without the disturbance of the tillage. So you think about your tillage, how's that, or your rotation, how's it affecting the pathogens, and then how's it affecting the beneficial organism that you'd like to be there. And we tend to go with this corn, soybean, small grain system, just by way of example. The corn follows the small grain. Corn is more moisture sensitive of these 3 systems. It's going to be the most drought prone. So it's coming after the small grain, so that's balancing our water part of it. The corn ties up a lot of nitrogen, leaves a lot of residue on the surface. That's fine because soybeans fix their own nitrogen. So the soybeans after the corn fits that nutrient dynamic. Then the small grains don't need as much nitrogen, so the soybeans help them out a little bit and they don't need a lot of help. But also the small grains introduce an extra year in the system so we don't have as many diseases and pests carry over to the next corn crop. So we don't have to worry about corn rootworm, and our pathogens, the residue has more time to break down with this 3rd element. And also this rotationally helps because small grains are cool season grass. The weeds that will grow in small grain are different than are going to grow in corn and soybean as warm season crops. So we're breaking up not only the insect disease life cycles, but we're breaking up the weed life cycles by adding this variation. So that's just one example. So think about those. So consider what are you doing with the water, what are you doing with your nutrients, and what are you doing to your beneficial organisms in your system and to the pathogens that you're trying to get rid of. So you want your rotation to keep the ground covered, maintain your beneficial microbes and insects, break up the life cycle of your pathogens, and balance your nutrient and moisture use. So with that, I'll turn this over to Joslyn.
Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the horticulture research that we're doing out at the Southeast Research Farm. So this is stuff from the growing season of 2022. But first of all, the credit is due to Dr. Christine Lang, who led and organized the horticulture research that we'll be discussing. So first off, we have the high tunnel research, and within that we have the grafted heirloom cherry tomatoes for high tunnel production, and then vertical specialty melons. So first off, we'll kind of go over the grafted heirloom cherry tomatoes. So a main question that we should kind of look at is why grafted tomatoes for high tunnel production? And a main thing that we can kind of look at, or like an angle to kind of take it from, is high tunnels are becoming a popular production tool for Midwest vegetable producers, specifically because the high tunnels are a way to extend the growing season and increase the crop production and to help improve the quality of produce. So when looking at continuously utilizing the high tunnel space for tomatoes, the challenges of soil-borne and disease and pest pressures, along with soil fertility and salinity issues arise. So this is where the why grafted tomatoes becomes the important point. Grafting scions to rootstocks can be a tool utilized to help counter the issues that you'll experience growing tomatoes on tomatoes. But before moving on, I want to kind of go over what like a scion and a rootstock are. So the scion is like the top portion of the graft selected for the horticulture properties, such as like the fruit, so like the tomatoes or like the peppers or cucumbers. And then the rootstock is the bottom part below the scion selected for the soil interaction properties. And an important thing to note as well is that when grafting, it needs to take place within like the vegetative stage. So that's like within 2 to 3 weeks after planting. So the scions that we selected for this study were indigo cherry drops and pink bumblebee. So the indigo cherry drops, which are here in this image, they are a deep purple to a red flesh, and they will yield 1 to 2 ounces of fruit. And then we also had pink bumblebee, and they have striped skin with pinks, yellows, and oranges, and they will yield fruit of less than 1 ounce. And then the rootstocks that were within this study were the DRO141TX, the Estamino, the Maxifort, and then we had the non-grafted control. And the DRO141TX puts a higher proportion of energy into the fruit than other vegetative rootstocks without compromising on vigor. And it has shown to carry a crop through high temperatures and long seasons just as well as the Maxifort. And then the Estamino is a strong generative rootstock that puts a high proportion of energy into fruit, and it's especially useful for tomatoes in cultivation for less than 6 months in unheated hoop houses or with small fruited varieties. And then the Maxifort is the vigorous vegetative rootstock for large fruits and for like longer season cropping. And then we, of course, have the non-grafted control. And all these rootstocks were combined with the scions of the indigo cherry drops and the pink bumblebee for a total of 8 replicated trial plots. Throughout this growing season, the plants did begin to exhibit signs of tomato spotted wilt virus in July, but it was found that there were no differences in the number of plants affected because of the scion or rootstocks used. And so because of the relatively high incidence of the tomato spotted wilt virus during the 2022 growing season, the research team plans to pause tomato trials for several years to decrease continuous vectoring and reproduction of the disease. So the yield results from this past 2022 growing season were the scion indigo cherry drops resulted in a higher per plant marketable fruit weight compared to the pink bumblebee, with the indigo cherry drops yielding 4.3 pounds per plant and the pink bumblebee yielded 0.7 pounds per plant. And then there was also no difference in the scion performance with the different rootstocks used. And then it was also found that there were no differences in the scion or rootstock effects on the weight of call fruit per plant. So then we can move on to the vertical specialty melons. So again, we have the question raised of why vertical melons? And as mentioned at the beginning of discussing the grafted heirloom tomatoes, high tunnels are a valuable production tool for Midwest producers. But again, choosing to produce high-value crops such as tomatoes and peppers might lead to the depletion of soil nutrients and soil-borne disease issues. So in looking to expand the diversity of crops grown in high tunnels, it becomes an important focus to kind of research things like vertical melons. So within the research done at the farm, we selected 4 specialty melon cultivars. So the one on your far left is the snow leopard, the top center is the honey blonde, the far right is the sugar cube, and the bottom middle is the grizzlet. So the grizzlet is very succulent and sweet, and the sweetness is hinted with an exotic spice, and it matures in about 75 days. And then the honey blonde has a flavorful orange flesh, and it's yellow skinned, and it's about 71 days to maturity. And then the snow leopard has a white skin with a green variegation, and then it has a white inner flesh, and it's about 71 days to maturity. And then the sugar cube is very uniform and it's heavily netted. Like you can kind of see on the bottom right picture there with the webbing kind of on the outer skin. And then it has a deep aromatic flesh and it's about 80 days to maturity. So the plot layout within the high tunnel was 2 replications of the 4 specialty cultivars selected. And we utilized cattle panels secured to T-posts in the ground. And then the melon plants were actually never pruned, but rather we allowed them to kind of grow and spread out, and then we clipped them using cucurbit clips. And something interesting that we found was that as the melons began to grow in size, we found that specifically the sugar cube, which is on the left, and the grizzlet, which is on the right in the pictures, they have to be secured with mesh produce bags because as time goes on and they start to ripen and get close to maturity, the vine will begin to like slowly dry up and separate from the plant, the melon. So you don't want that fruit dropping and smashing on the floor or damaging the other vines within the trellising up there. So looking at the yield results, we found that the snow leopard yielded more marketable fruit per plant than either the grizzlet or the sugar cube, with the honey blonde yielding similarly to the other 3 cultivars. And the number of cull fruit was also the highest from the snow leopard when compared to the other cultivars. Interestingly, though, there were no differences in the marketable or cull weight of fruit per plant or the individual weight among the cultivars. So now we're kind of moving on into like research that was done out in the field. So we're going to look at clover cover crops as a living mulch. And so again, a big question is, why living mulch? Well, the struggle with weed suppression and soil fertility management increases with the use of black plastic mulch and organic inputs. So during the growing season, clover cover crops such as living mulch may aid in weed suppression, nitrogen fixation, and soil erosion prevention. But with that comes some risks such as competition for space and light, which may lead to the production of lower vegetable outputs. So in this study, we utilized red clover, white Kira crossed clover, and then a bare ground control. And then when we seeded these plots, it's important to note that when we simultaneously seeded oats with the clover at a rate of 35 pounds per acre as a nurse crop for while the clover seedlings were establishing. And the squash varieties that were selected was Jester as the cash crop and Acorn as the guard rows. And then the plot layout, we had a total field size of 400 feet by 120 feet in a randomized complete block design, which with each of the 4 blocks split into 4 clover treatments with 4 managements randomized within each plot. And those 4 managements were no-till fabric, no-till no fabric, tilled fabric, tilled no fabric. However, as things happened, we had some really bad pest issues and we had squash vine borer issues. 75% of the plants in our plots were affected. And so the only action we could kind of take at that point was to cut open the locations where it was affected with pocket knives to slit open the stem. And then we took tweezers to pull the vine borers out to get rid of them. And then we took dense, wet soil and applied it to the cut and extracted location to create a cast, which then signaled regrowth and cell development within the squash. And you can see kind of in the lower right corner the picture of the one squash plant that doesn't look so happy among the rest of them. You can tell that that's exactly where it was lacking the ability to uptake water and nutrients. Because in the top left corner there, that's a picture of the woodiness and the hardness of the stem where the squash vine borer went in and began to do its damage. So harvest was completed on September 16 of 2022. The squash harvested was graded into the categories of marketable and non-marketable. And what we found was there was no significant differences between clover effects on jester squash yield. However, the bare ground treatments had a significantly greater amount of marketable weight and marketable fruit compared to the other clover treatments. The no-till plots had 48% less marketable squash compared to the other management treatments, and the marketable weight was the lowest outcome of the treatments. Cull number and weight of fruit were about the same for all the treatments. So in summary, these results show that bare ground treatments had the highest yield outcome, and all clover treatments had similar detrimental effects on squash yield. So looking ahead to further research will not be completed at this time on the grafted heirloom cherry tomatoes resulting from the presence of the tomato spotted wilt virus experienced in this past growing season. But then further research will be completed with the specialty melons for vertical production, along with the evaluation of clover cover crop as a living mulch in winter squash production. And then this coming growing season, we'll also begin looking at cabbage and utilizing clover as a living mulch with that crop. And the USDA NIFA Organic Transitions Program grant will be funding this research with the cabbage and living clover mulch. So a special thanks goes out to them in advance. So to kind of summarize things up, for producers interested in diversifying their current crops produced in high tunnels or diversifying their production methods out in field vegetable production, it is advised to start small and test out what works for you within your production system and the markets you have available. And also we have some field days coming up. So on July 11, we'll have a field day out at the SDSU Southeast Research Farm in Beersford, South Dakota. And we'll have some stuff, we'll be discussing stuff like the melons in the high tunnel and then the squash and the cabbage being grown out in the fields. And then Dr. Lang will actually be having the 3rd annual specialty crop field day on the SDSU Brookings campus on September 12. And some acknowledgements do need to be made with the research. So for both the grafted heirloom cherry tomatoes and the vertical specialty melons, we would like to thank the SDSU graduate student Alexis Barnes, along with the undergraduate research assistants Jacob, Ellie, and Ann, along with the SDSU Southeast Research Farm staff Peter Sexton, Gretchen, and Bradley Rops. And then again within the squash production, which is actually a picture of the transplants that went in up here, Alexis Barnes, who is the SDSU graduate student focusing on that, her research was funded by the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, administered by the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources, so a special thanks goes out to them. And then again, thanking the undergraduates and the staff out at the SDSU Research Farm, because not all of this could be done with one person, so.
We'll give you a chance for questions for anybody here at the end. We're going to talk about grazing crops and cover crops at the Southeast Research Farm, and I broke it. There we go. Back up one. Okay, how many here are familiar with the 4 or 5 principles or keys to soil health? Okay, I think the word is getting out there. So for those that aren't familiar or for a review, principle number 1, soil armor, keep the ground covered. Reduces erosion, protects against water erosion, raindrops hitting the soil and dislodging soil particles, wind erosion. Principle number 2, minimize disturbance. as little as you can disturb the soil is better. Again, protecting erosion and keeping that soil structure that Pete talked about intact. So here's a picture of putting in plots with a no-till planter. Number 3, plant diversity. The more diverse your rotation or your cover crop mix, the better. Diversity, I mean, usually is good in any situation. It spreads out risk, so if you have an issue with one particular species, you've got others to kind of fill in the gaps. Also, diversity on the top side increases the diversity on your underground livestock, that microbial population. Diversity, if you're going cover crops, I mean, if you pick from several different types, so the legumes like the clovers, crimson clover right here, forage peas, cowpeas if you want a warm season, the grasses, cereal grains, oats, wheat, rye, triticale, annual ryegrass, and the brassicas, radish, turnips, rapeseed, some of the forage brassicas are all good choices. Principle number 4, keep living roots in the soil for as much of the year as possible. I think this is probably the biggest boom for, for cereal rye as a cover crop, in that, I mean, you can see, you can see the frozen ground and a little bit of snow on the ground. We still got green rye out here, and those roots are alive and living through the winter time, and that helps support your microbial population underneath. Okay, sometimes it's 4 principles, sometimes it's 5. We're going to talk today about the 5th principle of building or soil health, and that is integrating livestock into your cropping system. So it might be dedicated crops, it might be cover crops, but putting livestock out there is a good proven practice. What happens when you're putting livestock, you got cattle or sheep or whatever out grazing cropland? Compaction and things, is it going to be detrimental to your next crop? In 2013, we had a field with oats and peas that we grazed, and then we came back and replanted sorghum and cowpeas, and we had some exclusion blocks that were not grazed. In 2014, we planted corn. The grazed areas yielded 190 bushels, and the ungrazed 195, so pretty much identical. You can see population wasn't hurt at all. Test weights very similar. Another example, 2014 we had soybeans. The prior year it had a rye cover crop on that before, and we had cattle out there. We had 3 treatments here. We had cattle grazing in the fall and in the spring, and in the spring only, and then we had some blocks where they did not graze at all. Here you can see soybean yields following that rye cover crop. No statistical difference, actually numerically. The grazed blocks actually yielded numerically higher than the ungrazed. So it shows you can run livestock on crop ground and not hurt the subsequent crop yields. Okay, why do we want to graze cover crops or crops? I think we need to look at what our goals are. Is it going to be, I mean, from a livestock perspective, is it going to be for maintenance? Are we going to be putting out breeding stock there, and we're concerned with, I mean, how many cows or ewes that we can carry for the season? Are we looking at gain as our primary goal? How much weight we can put on some lambs or some feeder cattle? Or maybe we're looking with chicken tractors, and you got hens out there, and it's egg production or broiler production. Nutrient recycling. So the plants are taking up nutrients from the soil, they're growing, that's all there. And we can, with livestock, we can take that residue or the green plants or the residue after a crop and run it through the livestock, and as Pete said, it makes those nutrients more available to the next crop than in their raw form. And then finally, putting livestock on the ground just helps to improve and speed up the building of that soil microbiology. You've got a lot of microbes that are coming out through the feces, through the urine, through the saliva that help to build those populations. Take half, leave half. Anybody heard of that? Okay, how much cover crop do you take, or how much crop, or in this case a pasture land, do you take? Typically, I mean, this old adage has been around for quite a while. This is my pasture at home a couple years ago. Dry spring, not a lot of rain, drought looked imminent, and so I did a little more intensive grazing management than I typically do. So you can see here my fence wire, and the cattle have been in here a couple days. How much more time do you think they've got to graze there? There's still some grass there. I actually was out there to move the fence and let them into the next section. Leaving plant material there, well, one, it helps, I mean, for erosion control. Two, you're shading the soil. If you graze down to where it looks like a putting green on a golf course, that sunlight is getting to the soil and it's warming it up, and that's bad for your subsurface biology. You want to keep the temperature cooler. So to keep some growth there helps shade the soil and keep those temps down. And then also, along with take half, leave half, is the adage, it takes grass to grow grass. And I'd like to show you this research done way back in 1955 by Frederick Jacob Kreider, who was an employee of the Soil Conservation Service. And he did a study which looked at percent forage removal and how that affected root growth 3 days after. And so, yeah, if you take none, you're not going to affect root growth. You could take 10% of that plant, nothing, 20, 30, 40%. At 50%, we start to see it affecting subsequent root growth. But look what happens. You go from 50 to 60. We're up to 50 to 80%, and at 70%, and then when you get down into the 80 and 90% defoliation, you're basically stopping all the root growth. You're going to have roots that kind of regress and shrink, because roots take in nutrients, bring it up to the plant so it can make food, and that's sent back down to the roots. And when you shave off the leaf, you're taking off the solar panels, and energy production stops. So I think we really want to, I mean, depending on what your goals are, but if you want regrowth, 50%, or at least, I mean, leaving 4 to 6 inches of grass, or depending on what your cover crop is a good idea. And here's another example, a take half, leave half on some grazing corn when we did some corn feeding trials in the field. Okay, grazing checklist. If you want to graze, if you're going to graze, there are, I guess, a process or some things you got to work through and what you're going to answer. Type of livestock, which is going to tie right in with your fencing. If you're going to do cattle, poly wire and step-in posts is relatively cheap. It's pretty easy. These are my cows at home, strip grazing, and I walk out there twice a day, walk along the wire, move the posts, and and they're right there ready to eat that fresh growth. It gives me a good opportunity to check on the herd and look for health problems. If you're going to go sheep or goats, you're going to need something better. They make some netting type fences. You want to make sure your livestock are acclimated to electric fence or energized fence, so you don't have any major issues. And I would recommend, at least around the perimeter, you got a more permanent type of a fence, maybe high tensile or woven wire or something. But for moving around and doing that type of rotational grazing, the temporary works well. Water. Do you want to bring the livestock to the water, or do you want to bring the water to the livestock? Depends on, the size of area you're working with and kind of what your resources are. You know, if you have a central dugout or stock dam, you can maybe have that as a hub and work around that. You can use a water tank on a trailer to where maybe you can get by with weekly or twice a week getting water out, and then run that into tanks. And I know there's equip dollars available for water, for building water sources, and so there's for piping, and maybe you just want to abandon or kind of have a dedicated walkway or alleyway that you build off of, and you just kind of sacrifice that land to get the cattle into water and then out to the field. Forage availability and timing. Again, we talked about the, what the goals are for the grazing. If you're wanting maintenance and carrying cattle or sheep or goats throughout the season, you need to kind of put together a plan, maybe starting with some cool season cover crops, and you work through those, and you can follow that up with a warm season, and then back to a cool. You know, some cover crops will have some regrowth, and some you go over at once and they're going to be done. So putting a plan together is important. Timing, when you're planting and what you're planting, so you don't want to be in June putting in cool season cereal grains. They're just not going to do good in the heat. So in the early spring, you get those cool season ones out, and then you get to June, you want to switch to the sorghums, sorghum Sudans, and cowpeas, those types of crops that thrive in the warm season. Consider your need maybe for supplemental feed or mineral supplementation. What happens if rainfall is short? What if your forage production isn't what you anticipated? Do you have a way to supplement, get the feed that you need? Do you have another place that you can move the livestock to? Until there's better forage available. Grazing method. So, you know, you can have a field the size of this room, and it's got so much forage in it, and you can figure, well, it'll last for so many days, and you turn this number of head in and let them at it. Or you can turn that same number of head in, and you can have a fence that you move across this room in succession. We've done both ways at the research farm and have found that we get twice the number of grazing days by using MIG grazing, managed intensive grazing, or AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So you can basically double your carrying capacity. Moving fence takes a little time, but you know, it's nice time. I do it in the morning, I do it at night when I get home from work, and it's relaxing. Like I said, it gives you a chance to see the livestock, and you get a lot more out of it. I'd also say the utilization of the plants is better. It's more uniform. You've got more uniform manure distribution, so so that fertility is getting more evenly applied to the field. If they've got the whole area to work at once, you got a lot more trampling. They pick out their favorite plants. They congregate in places of shade or water. You get damage to the soil in those particular areas, and then they underutilize other areas. So, managed grazing is a very good tool. And then I've got here risk. If you're going to be grazing, depending, I know this is specialty production. If you got high dollar crops, high value crops, how much risk can you allow? Livestock get out. It's inevitable. And they might be well behaved and you've got good fence, but all it takes is maybe a coyote runs through that field at night or whatever and spooks them and they run through the fence. Or you get deer going through and snag a wire. Things happen. So you do need to kind of figure out, I want to incorporate livestock into my system. Can I afford an episode like that? Or can't I? Or as you build your fences and maybe it's, you put them out in the day, bring them home at night to where you have a little more control or can reduce that risk. Okay, that is the kind of the quick overview I've got. So if you've got questions that I can answer or Pete or Joslyn would sure take them at this time. Okay, thank you.